You always exchanged words with everybody because it didn't matter what anybody was doing in and around the estate here.
For 7 years, the quietest woman inside the walls of Buckingham Palace kept her mouth shut. She watched the memoirs land on bestseller lists. She watched the interview that shattered a family play out on primetime television to 70 million viewers. She watched the Netflix cameras roll through rooms she had walked through for decades. And she said absolutely nothing. Not a word to journalists. Not a whisper to friendly columnists. Not a single sentence designed to set the record straight while the institution she had served for a quarter of a century was being publicly dismantled from a living room in California. Then, without warning, Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, finally spoke. And what she said did not just fill the silence. It detonated it. Sophie had been asked a straightforward question about the state of the modern monarchy. The room expected the kind of polished, diplomatic non-answer she had delivered flawlessly for nearly 30 years. Instead, she paused. The pause lasted just long enough for the silence to become heavy. And then she said it. In all her years inside the royal family, she had never encountered anyone whose behavior had tested the institution quite like the behavior of Meghan Markle. She said it plainly. Not with venom. Not with theatrical emotion. She said it the way a woman who has watched a very long story unfold finally decides that the era of polite silence has run its course. And because Sophie is the last person inside that family anyone expected to break rank, the sentence landed with a weight that no tabloid headline had ever carried before. Within minutes, the palace did something it almost never does. It released a statement that did not distance itself from her words. It simply confirmed that her views were consistent with the state. To understand why her words carried so much force, you have to understand who Sophie actually is and what she survived to earn the right to say them. She entered the British royal family in 1999, at arguably the most difficult moment anyone could have chosen to attach their name to the House of Windsor. The institution was still bleeding from the death of Princess Diana. The press was hostile. The public was skeptical. And Sophie, a young woman without aristocratic lineage or the protective armor of generational wealth, walked directly into the fire. She stumbled early. There was a tabloid sting that embarrassed her publicly and tested her marriage before it had found its footing. There were whispers that she would not last, that she was too ordinary, too exposed, too vulnerable to the machinery that had chewed up people far more powerful than her. And she responded the way almost nobody in modern public life responds anymore. She went quiet. She did the work. She rebuilt her reputation one unglamorous engagement at a time, visiting hospitals and conflict zones and blindness prevention programs in countries that would never make a front page. She became, over the course of 2 decades, one of Queen Elizabeth's most trusted confidants, a woman the late monarch reportedly considered the closest thing to a daughter she had within the family. When the person who has spent 25 years earning trust through silence finally decides to open their mouth, the sound it makes is not just loud. It is definitive. What made Sophie's account so destabilizing was not where it began. Most people expected her to start with the Oprah interview, or the Netflix series, or the engagement announcement that Meghan arrived from a world where visibility was currency, where personal brand was identity, where the loudest voice commanded the most attention. She stepped inside an institution built on the opposite principle entirely. Inside the House of Windsor, the longer you serve, the more you disappear into the work. The light does not radiate from the person. It reflects off the crown itself. Sophie watched Meghan push against that principle from almost the first week. Not loudly at first. Quietly. Strategically. Testing which walls would give and which would hold. And what Sophie saw in those early months convinced her that the woman standing next to Harry had not come to join the family. She had come to rearrange it. This is the part of Sophie's account that made even veteran royal correspondents stop writing and lean forward. Because Sophie was not describing ambition in the abstract. She was describing a specific, sustained pattern of behavior, and the target of that pattern was not who most people would have guessed. It was not Harry. It was not Catherine. It was not the Queen. The target, Sophie said, was William. The future king. Sophie was precise about what she was alleging. She was not suggesting anything romantic or inappropriate in that sense. What she described was something more calculated and in many ways more unsettling. She said Meghan appeared to be engaged in a deliberate effort to manufacture visible proximity to Prince William, to create a public impression of closeness that did not exist in private, to position herself in photographs and at engagements in ways that subtly communicated she belonged at the center of the Wales story rather than in the supporting architecture of the Sussex household. She walked through specific moments that senior staff had flagged at the time. A garden party just days after the royal wedding where Meghan greeted William with a warmth that staff noted was more familiar than the relationship warranted. A mental health engagement where cameras captured the moment that crystallized everything was the only time the so-called Fab Four appeared together on a public stage. The event was billed as a unified launch of a mental health initiative. The public saw four smiling royals sitting side by side. What Sophie described happening behind the scenes was something different entirely. Meghan pushed for seating that placed her closer to William than protocol allowed. She spoke over Catherine during the event itself. The fallout left Catherine in tears, and the two couples never again appeared together in that kind of unified format. Sophie said this was the moment the senior hierarchy understood that a quiet war had been declared. And the private file that the palace would eventually compile began growing from that date forward. Until Sophie spoke, most people understood the bullying story in a very narrow frame. They remembered the headlines from March 2021, timed just days before the Oprah interview aired. They remembered Jason Knopf's internal email raising concerns about how Meghan had treated personal assistants. They remembered that Buckingham Palace announced an investigation, that the findings were never published, and that the Sussex camp dismissed the entire thing as a coordinated smear. What Sophie confirmed was that the internal record extended far beyond anything the public had been allowed to see. It was not a single email from one frustrated aide. It was not two resignations. It was a running log of behavioral incidents compiled over a period of years, documented by multiple members of staff across multiple households, and preserved carefully enough that it still sits inside palace archives today. The entries, according to Sophie's account, included late-night messages sent to senior royals through channels that completely bypassed official communication structures. They included moments where Meghan had ignored the personal boundaries of Queen Elizabeth and the then Prince of Wales, forcing physical interactions that made both of them visibly uncomfortable. They included the repeated pattern of feeding details from private family conversations to American media contacts, constructing a narrative of the warm, open outsider being suffocated by a cold, archaic institution. Sophie said the most revealing thing about the file was not any. The hardest part of Sophie's account had nothing to do with titles or streaming deals or security arrangements or any of the battles that have filled headlines for years. It was the part where she described, very quietly, what she believes happened to Harry himself. Sophie was careful to acknowledge the wounds he carries. She spoke about the loss of his mother and the trauma of growing up inside a goldfish bowl and the particular weight of being the younger brother in a family where only the older one inherits the throne. These are genuine injuries, and she made clear that she still feels real affection for the young man she watched grow up inside those walls. But she also described what she observed happening after Meghan arrived. Between late 2019 and early 2020, the lines of communication between Harry and his old world began closing one by one in a way that did not look accidental. Informal contact with his brother became increasingly difficult to arrange. Messages went unanswered. Requests were declined with the same explanation every time. Meghan felt they needed more space. Meghan felt a particular meeting would not be helpful. Sophie called it a psychological blockade. She said she watched a man she had known for most of his life slowly become convinced that the family he grew up inside was actually the source of his pain rather than a possible refuge from it. She revealed that she had personally reached out to Meghan more than once during those early years. One outsider to another. One woman who had weathered public humiliation to another woman navigating unfamiliar terrain. She offered mentorship. She offered to share what she had learned during her own painful transition into royal life. Meghan declined every time, and her response, as Sophie recalled it, was always the same. She had Harry, and that was all she needed. Sophie's interpretation of those words was the most chilling moment of her entire account. Meghan did not want a mentor, Sophie said. She wanted a monopoly on Harry's loyalty. She needed him isolated from. No portrait of the story is complete without the woman who stands at the center of everything Meghan tried and failed to become. Catherine, Princess of Wales, is the figure against whom every comparison eventually collapses. And Sophie's description of her was the most tender passage of the entire afternoon. Catherine never tried to outshine anyone, Sophie said. She never demanded equal billing. She never insisted the institution reshape itself to match her ambition. She arrived year after year and did the work. While others were negotiating streaming contracts and calibrating photograph angles, Catherine was sitting on classroom floors learning about infant brain development, building an early childhood policy framework that will shape British public health for a generation. She understood from day one that the crown is a marathon and not a sprint, that the light does not come from the person wearing it, but reflects off the institution itself. And the British public, which has spent centuries developing a finely tuned radar for authenticity among its royals, recognized the difference between the two women almost immediately. The numbers confirm it with a clarity that no interview can replicate. Catherine's favorability across the Sophie also addressed something that had puzzled observers for years. The palace's long silence through the memoirs, the documentaries, the interviews, and the trademark filings. That silence, she revealed, had been a deliberate strategic decision made at the very top. King Charles and Prince William had concluded together that engaging with a performative adversary would only feed it the oxygen it required to survive. By refusing to respond, by focusing instead on state duties and carol services and cancer treatment and the slow, unglamorous work of a functioning monarchy, the palace had allowed the Sussex narrative to lose its fuel and evaporate without a single counter shot being fired. And the Sussex commercial operation, Sophie observed, had eventually run into a wall of its own construction. Streaming partners had quietly scaled back their arrangements. Charitable contributions had fallen sharply. The lifestyle brand had struggled to find an audience at the price point it chose. The fundamental contradiction at the heart of the entire enterprise had finally begun collapsing under its own weight. You cannot sell royal adjacency to an American audience while simultaneously telling that same audience that the royal family is a cold, dysfunctional, and hostile institution. The world eventually sees the contradiction, Sophie said, and the world stops paying for it. As Sophie brought her account to a close, she addressed the question that has hung over this story for years: whether there is a path back. She answered it with the calm finality of someone who has watched a long storm pass and is now surveying what it left behind. There would be no second Sandringham summit. There would be no quiet reintegration into working royal life. The door, Sophie said, was not locked. It had been built over. The decision had been made,